Three natures. Ooh. Oh.
Sorry, I was late on
That's
that.
all right. I'm gonna have to remember to not say anything wrong. Three natures. So the idea is that each thing is of three natures, or you could say all things have three natures. Technically, we would say it is useful to view each thing as having three natures, or we could say each thing has three characteristics. Sometimes we use the term lakshana characteristics, sometimes nature, svabha, in this literature. So we're saying everything, we can apply this lens to everything. Anything you hear, see, smell, think, any emotion, anything you taste, anything you feel with the body, all of it. So the three natures are the imaginary nature, the dependent nature, and the complete realized nature. The imaginary nature of things is what you think they are. The dependent nature is that they appear as they do, dependent on other things. And the complete realized nature is that they are not what you think they are. So pretty simple. If you have had understanding of this, you might find this pretty shocking. It is a radical, shocking, and enormously challenging worldview. We are saying that everything that you think is a thing is of an imaginary nature, and its complete realized nature is that it isn't what you think it is, and it is dependent on other things. So the implications of this are often the opposite of what people think they are. So what it definitely does not do is say that what matters to you doesn't matter, or that what you're perceiving doesn't matter. It definitely is not saying that. This will be a teaching. The teachings on the imaginary nature, in large part, are designed to remind us that what we do always has impact. And the dependent nature kind of reminds us that everything is always collective. And the complete realized nature, well, the implications are many, but right now I'll say, you don't have to wait for liberation. Don't wait. You're alive. Okay, so three natures: imaginary, dependent, and complete realized natures. I'm going to read a passage from the book that just kind of outlines these at the introduction to try and develop these ideas a little bit. And my plan here is to talk for a while, 3 or 4 hours, and then make some time to hear from other people, questions or reflections. So here we go. Every aspect of what we would conventionally call experience is of these three natures: your sights, sounds, smells, tastes, physical sensations, thoughts, emotions, and our sense of being a self. For example, the cobalt blue car that I can see outside my window is of an imaginary nature. Whatever I am experiencing it to be right now, a memory, as I'm currently looking at letters on the screen, or now, as I turn my head to look at it again, whatever I think it to be is a construction of habits of consciousness and imagination. I suspect it will take some time for you to consider this a reasonable or useful claim. And so, dear reader, that's why I'm writing this book. That car is also of a dependent nature. Countless conditions that are not the car create the appearance of a car. Reflected sunlight, ocular nerves, supply chain software, oil refineries, the desire for wealth, and so on. This car is also of complete realized nature. It isn't what I think it is. Recognizing that things aren't what you think they are can radically disarm the patterns of your mind that cause you to suffer and to cause suffering. For example, in order to see the car in my normal way, I am usually ignorant of or ignore a vast array of conditions on which the appearance of the car depends. Conditions that cause suffering in this time of climate crisis. These teachings are to help us move beyond this kind of ignorance. The so-called knowledge that white people are inherently superior to Black people, and the purported fact that race exists as a biological phenomenon, were confirmed by 19th century scientific experiments. which have since been disproven. This caused and causes incalculable harm. This so-called knowledge is imaginary. It arises from conditions, and its complete realized nature is that it is not real. And yet millions of people thought and still think it is true. Although many of us do not, the impacts of this view are pervasive. It affects where people live, the jobs we have, the wealth we inherit, our access to education, and so much more. They are alive in how I experience the world. This teaching is here so we may continually grow in our capacity to end and transform harmful patterns of which we are often unaware. By learning to see the three natures of the ideas that maintain harmful systems, we open the way for liberation. The three natures can be misapplied and easily misunderstood. Understanding the imaginary nature invites humility, not grandiosity. It affirms agency. It does not deny experiences. Understanding the dependent nature affirms kinship with all things. It does not deny difference or boundary. Understanding the complete realized nature brings faith, compassion, and joy. It does not deny suffering. The three natures provide medicine for our ongoing daily sufferings, no matter how small. So, in teaching this material, and in fact, in teaching in any Mahayana context where the basic understanding is that all things are empty of independent existence, one of the challenges is talking about why things matter, why you should practice, why liberation is possible. So these teachings are specifically designed to emphasize why things are possible and why practice matters, given that things do not have absolute separate existence. And so when you hear this, it's very easy over and over again to fall into this kind of idea that we're saying that things don't matter. But if you think of the examples I gave, we don't say the car doesn't matter. We say that because we view the car through the lens of personal utility, through the lens of this is just something that gets me what I want or doesn't get me what I want, we end up ignoring the vast array of conditions that have massive downstream impacts. That's true for every single thing. When you drink a cup of water, when you say a word to someone, when you have an attitude towards your internal state, always. Likewise with the idea of race, although race is not a real thing, it clearly has impacts. And in fact, in many kinds of people who are doing anti-racism work, often the first thing you do is you explain and look at how race is not a real thing. You can analyze it, see how it was constructed in the last 400 or 500 years, how the boundaries of it are all completely murky, and how it has constantly been reconstructed. And then you say, well, now that we know race is not a real thing, let us spend our effort dismantling the harmful impacts that it has. So basically, the methodology that the three natures presents for practice is very similar to that particular methodology that many people are using these days to try and make a better world. So I'm going to shift to talking about each nature in order: imaginary, dependent, and complete realized nature. So the imaginary nature of things is what you think they are. So from a Yogacara perspective, one of the principal ways you can tell you're imagining something is if you think it's an object that you're viewing, it's imaginary. Because the distinction between subject and object is just a tendency of mind. It's not an absolutely real thing. Likewise, if you think anything exists or doesn't exist, also those are categories mind creates. What? I don't know, I didn't make this up. But anyway, really shattering every possible category. Duration, space, all these things are the way we perceive them is only the way we perceive them based on our conditioning as people, individual people. Of course, animals have different ones. Sometimes I wish I could have some dog conditioning. I probably have a little bit of dog conditioning, but I wish I could just like jump into a dog life. What is that like? For other people, right? So when we talk about the imaginary nature, the implications are many. One of the most obvious ways that Buddhist literature throughout Buddhist traditions, from the earliest layers to the latest, consistently will use the idea that things are like a dream or imaginary or not ultimately real as a way, a medicine that allows us to sometimes just cut through our afflictions. So I'm sure many people have had the experience of being really upset about something. You have an argument with somebody, you're just mad as heck. And then like a week later, you're just like, what was that? Why was I so worried about that? So the thing is, you see from that gap that the experience of the anguish was created by the way you were perceiving, that is to say, imagining the situation. And this language can sometimes help us to be like, wait a minute, I'm just not doing that. You start to have the same argument you've had with someone in your family for the 87,000th time, and you just go, I'm not making this same thing up again. It's possible. It's possible. So that's one of the most common ways the medicine of the idea that things are imaginary is used throughout Buddhist literature. But in the Yogacara, it has a particular and distinct implication in that in Yogacara, we emphasize that the imagination is produced by conditions that we are participating in. So the basic idea is our moment of experience or imagination is the product or the fruit of seeds. So any act of thinking, any emotional act, like feeling an emotion, any action of body, including speech. So sometimes you hear this formulated as body, speech, and mind. I'm just dividing it up a little differently. Any act in this way plants a seed that will produce a similar fruit at a later date. And so in any moment, what you're experiencing is the seed, the fruit of a lot of seeds from Lord knows when. And in every moment you are planting seeds, lots of them, that will produce what will be experienced. So this is in Buddhist terms called karma, but in Yogacara, they tend to very frequently use the metaphor of seeds and fruit. So the basic idea here, so just to, that sounded maybe very abstract. So like if I look at someone and I go, why are you such a jerk? I don't like you and you're wrong-headed, and you've never done that, I know, but someone might. And in that moment, what happens, there's seeds of alienation because you see the person as an object. There's seeds of judgment because you see them as being wrong. There's generally seeds of affliction because even if you're not aware of the emotional state, which you're probably not because you're focused on the object, seeds of anger and frustration are churning and being planted. This creates a world where people think each other are jerks. That's how we get a world like that. Conversely, you can have a moment where you're like, and you go, wait a minute, here's a person. I feel a little frustration. Oh, I feel a little frustration with this person. I mean, now don't take this personally. In that moment, there's seeds of connection, of openness, of compassion for your own feeling state that has arisen. This creates a world where people have openness and compassion. It's possible. And it's, you know, it's like, doesn't this ring true to your experience? You've seen this happen, right? So we have choice. We're each always involved in creating what the world would be. Any sentient being in any circumstance always has the capacity to plant seeds that are conducive to well-being and liberation, without exception. Wow. No pressure. Because I'm telling you, it's always true. You get up in the morning, what are you doing? Normally, most of us are kind of just operating unconsciously, just like some karma comes up, we just kind of do the same stuff. Well, maybe it's not that bad. It might be really bad. I'm a recovering addict and alcoholic. I can tell you, I know how to have waking up be bad. I can do that. Probably not alone. We can transform the world we live in. That's the point. Liberation is possible, and what you do always matters. That's why when you're training at a Zen temple, it's like we have verses for when we brush our teeth. So we brush our teeth for universal liberation, wash behind our ears for universal liberation, take food for universal liberation, because it plants seeds of aspiration, openness, compassion. You can do this in your house. Your kids might think you're weird or whatever, but you could just do it quietly. Like, oh, I'm listening to you because I want everyone to be free from suffering. It changes things. So the dependent nature, everything is a dependent nature. It appears as it does dependent on other conditions. And usually we're kind of either ignoring or unaware. So those are both terms for the avidya, basic karmic driver of suffering, ignorance. Ignoring whether it's active or passive. Either way. Plant seeds. So yeah, we usually kind of not noticing. So one thing that you'll see mentioned in Yogacara texts sometimes is the idea of conceptualizing interdependence. Well, that's just thinking Thich Nhat Hanh style about how something depends on other things. So, you're going to have a glass of water instead of being like, my glass of water. You go, oh, wow. Think about all that had to happen for this to come here. Rain, a whole aquifer system, people who run water treatment plants, taxation. Wow, I better pay my taxes. I'm going to quit complaining about taxes because I like drinking water. Changes how we are. So we can think about the dependent nature of things, and that's a way to begin to access or be more aware of the dependent nature. I think it is also true that practicing Zazen and the more simple forms of Buddhist meditation in particular, but maybe all of them, I don't know, tends to naturally produce awareness of, or a immediate knowingness of the dependent nature. So generally speaking, a lot of people, when they come to practice, they're like, geez, I just realized most of the time I'm just going through my life and it's like, I'm not seeing almost anything. And there's this little narrator, blah, 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 blah. And then you start to practice and you're like, wow, I walk down the street and I hear the birds and I see trees in ways I've never seen. My spouse asked me for something and I turned to them and I actually listened. That's a good idea. So this tendency to feel less alienated and more open and connected and porous is a very natural aspect that comes through Zazen in particular. It's actually basically all we're doing, right? You just sit and, I don't know, I never know how to say this. You just sit and, the universes. It's cool. Yeah, the universe is universing. Instead of like, I gotta figure something out here. Well, we do that too. That's okay. That's part of it too. So anyway, there can be this very natural kind of opening and porousness and connection that is an opening to how things are dependent. They're not so alienated and separate. Feels usually, for most people, this is something that feels really good. So it's great. Becoming aware of the dependent nature also can be quite painful. Because when we really are aware of the dependent nature in the most ultimate sense, you realize you can't be separate from any suffering anywhere. It doesn't mean you should go home and try and feel all the suffering in the world. I don't recommend that. Not a good idea. That's not going to work with your current system. My guess is, I don't know how you are. But yeah, we get closer to suffering because normally we're pretending as we look through the lens of oh, I just want to get the world into a shape that I can kind of organize and feel good about, like I'm getting what I want and I'm not getting what I want. We ignore so much. And so, through practice, maybe you get closer to a community of people who suffer a lot, like my friends who work with unhoused people. It's painful. Or like my work with addicts in recovery, it's painful sometimes. Sometimes it's really inspiring. Sometimes it's pretty painful. When you do anti-racism work, it doesn't really work unless you get closer to the actual pain of the experience. You can't see what you're working against. And yeah, it's hard to just go in a space where people are just mad as hell because they've been traumatized by a system that brutalizes people just because of the apparent race which they've been born into. Or climate change work. Anybody here get a little burned out on climate change work? I've tried that a few times. It's hard. That's why Joanna Macy's work on climate change starts exactly. She says you have to look at the pain and let it in. You can't, it's hard, but then you go, oh, I can move through that veil. I can tolerate it. Now that's pretty good. So it may be hard. And you may be like, I'm not even there. I'm just trying to sit zazen and it's freaking me out. And I have anguish coming up. That's what my initial practice was, just sitting in the Zen of crying all the time. It was great. It was completely liberating because there was room to see what was real. Oh, the dependent nature of things moving through. So it is my conviction, although it may be hard. You might be like, this is hard. I don't want to do this. How free do you want to be? I think Monica's heard me say that 87,000 times. Well, I still am curious. We can really get free if we'll get honest with the whole thing. Yeah. There's something really wondrous that can open up within ourselves and within relationship with others. Oh, I want to do a little reading on this. Yeah. Little reading on the dependent nature. So one of the real fun things about this for you Mahayana Buddhists is that, the text basically says the imaginary is like this, the dependent nature is like this, the complete realized nature is like this, they're distinct in these ways. And by the way, they're all non-dual and identical. So you may find as you listen to this, you'll be like, wait, which one is this? And so in some ways they blur. In particular, well, no, all of them blur across each other. So that's just the way it is. I have got the wrong page though. Oh, here we go. We don't passively receive the reality of the world through our senses and then respond to it. The world we experience is created. It is the active cognition of seer and seen. That's from the text, the active cognition of seer and seen. Our life is created by our karma, and we create karma in every moment. We have the power to plant seeds that will create a better world. This body of teachings emphasizes the impact of each moment of intentionality. Our power lies in the quality of heart and mind we offer to the moment. Why do I think this worldview is more effective than materialism for healing our suffering and freeing us from collective modes of violence, oppression, and destruction? I will answer with some lines from a Chinese Chan nun named Baoqi. She wrote, "The vastness of karmic consciousness is hard to prove. But when Mr. Zhang drinks, then Mr. Li gets drunk." Sometimes I get a call, or I see an obituary telling me that another friend of mine has died from addiction. I've lost a dozen friends so far, and I can never know what part my enabling of their intoxication played, or the impact their deaths and addictions will have on future generations of their families. The web is too complex to map with materialist tools. I can never know the impact of the thousands of hours I've spent working with addicts in recovery either. I have witnessed the awakening of so much freedom. One of Baoqi's inspirations, the great Chan nun Miaozong, wrote, "When outside the diamond door he glowered, inside the stable the wooden horse's face turned red." In the verse above, there is no physical connection between the man's glower and the wooden horse's face, and yet there is reaction and connection. We cannot ultimately know when or where the results of any karmic seed will manifest, but manifest they will. Miaozong wrote her lines in a Chan compilation she created in the 12th century. But could she have known that in the 17th century, Baoqi and her Dharma sister Zukui, looking to revive the rarely recorded teachings of a female master of Chan, would pull them from obscurity and write their own commentaries? Or that Beata Grant in the 21st century would again revive them in English? I believe that buying a chunk of an animal killed 1,000 miles away, or offering a caring smile for a person on the street, as well as each tiny moment of anxiety, desire, or compassion you cultivate, has an impact on every living being. I can't measure it. Miaozong says the wooden horse's face turns red. A wooden horse is a classic Buddhist metaphor for something that has no reality or causal agency, like the horns of a rabbit, a wooden man, or a stone woman. Miaozong invites us into a worldview of mystery where we don't know or see what is ultimately real, but where an angry glare causes suffering we can't calculate, where a smile has radiance beyond the limits of our knowing, where our actions really matter. All of this isn't real, but it's as real as it gets. So it's real because it's complete realized nature right now. Cool. What does that mean? Well, things that we imagine are things are not things. So they don't actually, in an absolute sense, have the capacity to cause anything to happen to us. We can't be impinged on them because they're not real things. Now, I'm not saying it doesn't seem like they do, and that doesn't matter. I'm just saying in the ultimate sense, what a Buddha sees, or what makes a Buddha, in a simple formulation would be to say a Buddha is a being who does not suffer, does not cause suffering, and sees what is real. Does not suffer, does not cause suffering, and sees what is real. And the seeing is what is real is the basis on which they don't suffer and they don't cause suffering. Now, the thing is, the Buddha doesn't go to another place to have this happen where everything is awesome. In fact, all the literature we have about Buddhas is they're sitting around like this with a bunch of people in the same kind of place we all live in, seeing clearly with the result, according to the tradition, that they don't suffer and they don't cause suffering. So the complete realized nature is what Buddhas see. And the seeing of the complete realized nature is what makes a Buddha. So the thing is, you can practice and you can go from just being caught by the imaginary nature to being aware of the dependent nature and seeing the complete realized nature. Pretty cool. In the text, it says, for the purpose of growth and understanding, these natures are often understood in stages from the point of view of conventions and insight into them. However, guess what? It's already a complete realized nature. You don't have to wait and like fix yourself or fix something else. It's here. You might think, sounds good, pal. I want some of that. Well, you already have it. But I know it doesn't feel like we have it. I know that. So one of the most important things is to remember that we're not saying the complete realized nature destroys the imaginary nature. They're all always here. Both true. This is why like the literature of Buddhism shows a Buddha who shows up for people who are suffering because he knows they're suffering, because people are caught in this imaginary nature. So this all may seem a little improbable or not. I don't know. Maybe you're like, sweet, I already knew I was in the complete realized nature. I'm not worried about it. That's great. Enjoy. So oftentimes the complete realized nature will be talked about in terms of the complete realized nature of the phenomena conventionally understood to be the self. I know that's a long sentence. Or the complete realized nature of the phenomena that would be conventionally understood to be other. So I'm not saying self and other because those aren't real things. Anyway, but they will talk about it this way. So at the end of Vasubandhu's 30 verses on consciousness only, the last verse says, this is the inconceivable, wholesome, unstained, constant realm, the blissful body of liberation, the Dharma body of the great sage. So I'm waving my hands around because this is my realm and this is my body, but you can wave your hands around too if you want to and say the same thing, and the same thing is true according to this teaching. Now in the text, he's saying, this is what you see when you have attained realization, but it's also how things already are. Both those things are true. Now, Hakuin Zenji puts this a little more simply at the end of the Song of Zazen, where he says this, he uses the same, he basically paraphrases. He said, this very place is the lotus land, this very body the Buddha. Nice. When Dogen Zenji decided to write a text explaining why you should do Zazen and how to do Zazen, he opens it thus, Fukanzo Zengi. The way is originally perfect and all-pervading. How can it be contingent on practice and realization? The true vehicle is self-sufficient. What need is there for special effort? The whole body is free from dust. Who can believe in a means to brush it clean? It's never apart from this very place. What is the use of traveling around to practice? It's the same thing. The body is realization. Everything perceived is realization. So this is why Dogen says you should practice Zazen. Because you're Buddha in Buddha land. What do Buddhas do? They practice Zazen. Yeah, so it's not like, oh, let's practice Zazen and then we'll finally be a little less terrible. In my case, that might sort of be true also. I do dwell on the imaginary nature. I'm going to read two very short passages related to the complete realized nature of the phenomena conventionally understood to be the self, and then of the phenomena conventionally understood to be our environment. This is from a chapter called Already Buddha. When I came to Buddhist practice, I was seeking something else. I sought an escape from the anguish I experienced. My therapist told me it was the anguish of trauma from the past reproducing itself. My psychiatrist told me my brain didn't process serotonin properly. My addiction recovery friends called it defects of character, self-will, run riot. My Buddhist studies called it afflictive karma. All these ways of looking at it have their utility, and I am deeply grateful for all who have supported me in finding the wondrous, joyful existence of today. When we suffer, when we see the suffering of others, it is right to seek wellness, to seek something else. However, it is also true that there is not something else, that you and I are not and cannot be broken. For if there is brokenness, there must be a wholeness that is elsewhere. This is a duality, and duality is just a habit of mind. And the complete realized nature of where we're at. Can you get to that? Recently, I heard a talk by a Dakota elder named Bob Clanderud. He spoke of the total kinship of all life. He told us that the confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota rivers near my home on US-occupied Dakota land is called Bedote. For the Dakota, Bedote is the origin of the universe, the land of Genesis. In his words, it is Eden. He asked us, now that you know you live in Eden, how will you choose to live? Well, thanks for your kind attention, folks. Nice to share some words. I think it's really nice to hear other voices. It's really wonderful to hear many voices, and voices can do many things. So questions are welcome, and reflections are welcome. But it's nice to be somewhat terse, so there's room for many people. And I just want to say, like, questions can be, really, really particular. Like, how do you relate Dogen's theory of time with the Yogacara, whatever, that kind of thing. Or you can just be like, geez, every time I go to work, I want to smash the coffee pot against the wall. How does this help? So, just anything that's on your heart.
Can you say that reality is contextual? Like, for instance, in a dream, like it certainly was real at the time, but looking back, it no longer seems real, or a horrible like argument